Hello and welcome to Wealth Mindset Lab. Thank you for joining us today. Get comfortable, clear your mind, and prepare to discover powerful insights in this captivating documentary. In 1950, Sam Walton was forced to sell the most successful store he had ever built for almost nothing. Not because the business failed. It was the most profitable variety store in the entire state of Arkansas. He lost it because of a clause buried in a lease he signed 5 years earlier, a clause he didn't think to negotiate because he was 26 years old and just grateful to have a store at all. His landlord's son wanted the store for himself. The lease had no renewal option. There was nothing, legally, Sam Walton could do. He had built the best store in town from nothing. And in one afternoon, a piece of paper he hadn't read carefully enough took it all away. Most men would have learned to be afraid of risk after that. Sam Walton learned something else entirely. And nearly 2 decades later, that lesson built the largest retailer in the history of the world. This is the experiment. Kingfisher, Oklahoma, March 29th, 1918. Sam Walton is born into a farming family during one of the most economically unstable periods in American history. His father worked as a farm mortgage broker, a job that during the Great Depression frequently required him to foreclose on neighbors and relatives who couldn't pay their debts. Young Sam was sometimes brought along on these visits. He watched his father deliver bad news to people who had nothing left to give. He watched the careful, respectful way his father handled these conversations. Never cruel, always direct, always leaving the person with whatever dignity could be preserved in the moment. This is the first principle the Wealth Mindset Lab needs you to understand about Sam Walton. He learned to read rooms and read people before he ever learned to read a balance sheet. He took on jobs constantly as a boy, milking cows, delivering newspapers, selling magazine subscriptions door to door. By the time he was in high school, he was, by his own later account, the most consistent income earner in his entire family. Not because his family forced him to. Because he had discovered early a simple truth that most people spend years avoiding. Selling things to people you understand is not humiliating work. It is the foundation of everything that comes after it. He attended the University of Missouri, studying economics, and continued working multiple jobs throughout his education. Waiting tables, lifeguarding, anything that kept money coming in. He graduated in 1940. He served in the Army during World War II. And in 1945, at 27 years old, with savings of only a few $1,000s, much of it borrowed from his father-in-law, he opened his first store, a variety store franchise in Newport, Arkansas. What Sam Walton did with that first store reveals the second principle of his wealth mindset. And it is the principle this entire video is built around. He became obsessed, not with selling more at higher prices, but with selling more at lower prices, faster, in higher volume, than anyone around him believed was possible. He drove for hours to visit competitors' stores in other towns, walking the aisles, counting inventory, studying what worked and what didn't. He drove to wholesale suppliers personally instead of waiting for sales representatives, negotiating directly to cut out the markup. He discovered something simple that the franchise system he operated under actively discouraged. If he priced items lower than the suggested pricing, even on items where his profit margin per unit shrank, his total profit increased, because volume increased so dramatically that it more than compensated. This sounds obvious now. It was radical in 1945. Within 5 years, Walton's Newport store had grown into the most successful store of its kind in the entire region, in a town with a population of only about 7,000 people. He had built something extraordinary, from almost nothing, through pure operational obsession. And he had done it all on a 5-year lease. A lease he had signed at 26 years old, eager, grateful, and focused entirely on getting the store open, rather than scrutinizing every clause of the paperwork that made it possible. In 1950, the lease came up for renewal, and Sam Walton discovered that the lease he had signed contained no option for him to renew it. His landlord had a son who had watched Walton's success for 5 years and wanted the store and the location for himself. Walton offered to buy the store outright. He offered to negotiate a new lease at a higher rate. He explored every legal option available to him. There were none. The lease was unambiguous. The location, the building, the fixtures he had spent 5 years building a customer base around. None of it was legally his to keep. He had built the most successful store of its kind in the region, and he was going to lose all of it. The building, the location, the years of relationships with local customers. Because of a few words in a document he had not negotiated carefully enough at 26. Here is what Sam Walton said, decades later, about this exact moment. And it is the single most important psychological detail in his entire story. He called it the worst single mistake of his business life. Not because the store failed, because he had let inattention to a detail destroy years of obsessive, successful work. Most people, at this exact moment, having built something extraordinary only to lose it through a technicality outside their control, experience one of two psychological responses. The first is bitterness, a permanent grievance against the unfairness of the world, a story they tell for the rest of their life about how they were wronged. The second is caution, a permanent fear of ever building something that exposed ever again, deciding that risk itself was the enemy. Sam Walton chose neither. He chose a third response, the one this entire channel has been built to study again and again in every figure we have covered. He treated the failure as a research finding, not a verdict. He went back through every decision he had made in Newport. What worked, what didn't, what he would never again leave to chance. He identified, specifically and permanently, 2 rules he would never break again. Never sign a lease without negotiating a long-term renewal option. Never build your entire identity around a single location you do not control. These 2 rules, born directly from the pain of 1950, became structural pillars of an empire that would eventually span thousands of locations across the world. With the proceeds from selling his interest in the Newport store, far less than its true value, but something, Sam Walton moved his family to Bentonville, Arkansas, and opened a new store. This time, he negotiated the lease personally, clause by clause, with a long-term renewal option secured before he signed anything else. But the deeper change was not in his contracts. It was in his entire approach to building a business. He began obsessively studying self-service retail, a still-emerging concept where customers pick their own items off open shelves rather than asking a clerk behind a counter for everything, dramatically reducing labor costs and increasing the volume a single store could process. He drove across multiple states, visiting any retailer experimenting with the model, taking notes, asking questions, absorbing everything he could. By the mid-1950s, he and his brother were operating multiple stores under their own name. But Sam Walton had identified something the rest of the industry was still slow to grasp. The future of retail was not going to belong to the best single store in any one town. It was going to belong to whoever could build the most efficient system for moving goods at the lowest possible price across the largest possible number of locations. None of which, individually, the company could ever be catastrophically dependent on. This is the principle that 1950 had burned permanently into Sam Walton's thinking. Never again build something that one landlord, one lease, one decision outside your control could take away in a single afternoon. In 1962, Sam Walton opened the first store under a new name in Rogers, Arkansas. Walmart. He was 44 years old. He had been in retail for 17 years. He had lost his best store once already, and built the entire architecture of his next decades specifically so that loss could never happen to him again in the same way. What Sam Walton built over the following decades is, by now, one of the most studied business stories in American history. The scale alone is almost incomprehensible. By the time of his death in 1992, his company operated across nearly every U.S. state, employed hundreds of thousands of people, and had fundamentally reshaped how retail worked in America. But the number misses the psychological architecture underneath it. 4 principles, every one of them traceable directly back to a lease clause in 1950. First, negotiate the structure before you fall in love with the opportunity. The eagerness that cost him his first store taught him to separate excitement about a deal from diligence about its terms, permanently for the rest of his career. Second, build distributed strength, not singular dependence. No single store, no single supplier relationship, no single landlord would ever again be allowed to hold the kind of power over his business that one man's lease decision held in 1950. Third, treat every loss as a data point, not an identity. His own later interviews never frame the Newport loss as a tragedy that defined him. He frames it as the most useful single business lesson of his career, directly, explicitly, repeatedly. Fourth, obsess over the fundamentals everyone else considers boring. Lower prices, higher volume, tighter supply chains. None of this was glamorous. All of it compounded, relentlessly, over decades, into the largest retail operation in the history of the world. Sam Walton did not become unstoppable because he never lost anything. He became unstoppable at the exact moment he decided that a devastating, unfair loss would be the last time inattention to detail ever cost him something he had built. Here is the question this experiment was always building toward. Every figure in this series has faced a moment that could have ended everything. Rockefeller faced chaos in the oil fields and built order from it. Morgan faced a collapsing economy and held the door locked until trust was restored. Tesla faced the loss of his greatest patents and never built the financial structure to recover from it. Ford faced 2 failed companies and an axe through a wall before he found his rhythm. Napoleon Hill spent 20 years broke while writing the book that would teach millions how not to be. Musk bet 2 companies on the same month and survived by margins almost too thin to believe. And Sam Walton, at 32 years old, watching his life's work get nailed shut behind a sold sign because of a clause he didn't read carefully enough, chose to extract a lesson instead of a grievance. That single choice, made in a quiet moment of devastating unfairness, is a meaningful part of the reason a small variety store in Newport, Arkansas, eventually grew into the largest retailer on earth. The question this experiment leaves you with is simple and uncomfortable. What is the lease clause in your own life right now? The oversight, the detail, the thing you were too eager or too grateful to scrutinize carefully, that could take everything away in a single afternoon. You cannot always prevent the loss, but you can decide in advance what you will do with it when it comes. The experiment is complete. Think differently. Build differently.